My family and I acquired a house through relatives that had passed and had lived in a much more rural area of Mississippi. A beautiful and large farmhouse that had been renovated over the years into something much more elegant and larger. It was well taken care of, sure, but after the passing of my relatives, they left it in their will to my side of the family. Surprisingly, my siblings did not want to touch it. They all had their fancy real estate, since every other sibling of mine got heavily into investing, and I was the odd one out who went to med school. We had no idea that moving into such a home would prove to be so haunted. I've never dealt with the paranormal before this experience. I've seen a lot of unexplained or simply just strange things that happened to me personally. It was as if that I had been visited by the spirit of my late aunt ever since we had moved in. She didn't seem to like us, which seemed quite odd for an aunt that never got along with her sister in the first place. Not only did she apparently not want us there, but other spirits seemed to act out towards us too. We'd be hearing all sorts of things throughout the night, like heavy footsteps walking through the house. Nobody was even home, other than me sometimes. Doors slamming shut, opening on their own accord. Many more occurrences, too many to name. The scariest thing had to have been the shadows roaming around the hallways at night, when everybody else is asleep in bed. I remember one night getting up to use the bathroom and seeing this large shadow lumbering towards me down the hallway. These figures that seemed to be a distorted version of a normal human being. Stranger still, is somehow these apparitions looked as if they had been burned. They moved quickly and appeared to be entirely black. No facial features or anything. One evening, I was the only one awake right around 3 a.m. I could not sleep, so I decided to just watch some TV. That's pretty normal, right? Just as I turned on the living room lamp next to me, one of these shadows or entities walked past my doorway from where it stood in the hall. It seemed a little more transparent actually, and I was quite surprised that I saw it out of the corner of my eye. My entire heart skipped several beats, my stomach up in my throat. No matter how dark the house was before all this happened, everything just fell eerily quiet. You could feel it there, but you couldn't see anything because the hallway was pitch black. It's like you could just feel it there in the darkness, watching your every move. I'm not sure why, but I had a really bad feeling. So I decided to get up and walk towards where it stood before in the hall. I don't know why. This shadow thing produced a loud thump from inside one of the rooms off the hall. That alone made me jump. It crept out slowly from around the corner and began walking towards me at a very quick pace and started to make this low humming noise, almost like an electronical mechanical noise. It made my entire body react, all my hairs standing on end. It walked right through me, actually, making this sizzling smell, like the smell of burning hair or something, or even, dare I say, sulfur. And as soon as the entity passed right through me, it was like this brisk rush of cold air. I don't have a whole lot of other encounters to share other than those, but my favorite room of the house was always the living room. I spent a lot of time there. It had a fireplace and it seemed as though it got some decent light from the windows. But at night, before bed, it took on this whole other energy. Unlike most of my other rooms, and I say other rooms because I always like to claim the living room as my own, because I spent so much time in it. That was one of those rooms that felt so cold all the time, and so dark, even with all the lights on. As far as personal encounters, I've also seen this ghost of my aunt standing there in the doorway watching me. She seemed odd with this creepy expression on her face. Then, her eyes would always look hollow and empty, and she would sometimes smile at me, but not in a nice warm way, in a way like she wanted to take my life. But I only saw the ghost of my great aunt several times, not too many. Not like the shadow people that I used to see all the time. I knew there were other spirits there, because I would see them too. but they always seemed to be figures and relatives that I never met or never knew. These apparitions actually had shapes and resembled people, and not just like shadow people. In fact, I also met the ghost of a little boy, and he was probably no older than 7. I got the impression that he had fell and drowned in a well in the property many, many years ago. His clothing seemed to resemble that of the 1930s. Very, very old. I would always see him sometimes, but never in the house. Always in the yard. And he'd always just blankly be staring in the house, and then just vanish and disappear. He was one of the many spirits to show himself. It's like they would just show themselves whenever they wanted. It was very strange. Another spirit that had showed herself was apparently my great-great-grandmother, who died at the age of 23 after becoming incredibly ill. I was never told what she died from, but after giving birth to my great-great-grandmother, shortly after she passed, and one day, when I'm still a kid, I'm out there working outside with my father, and she just came and appeared right next to my father and sat down. My dad didn't see anything at all, but saw me look over immediately, and I was incredibly frightened. It's like these ghosts would only show themselves to me and nobody else. My parents never really saw them, for whatever reason. But anyway, there's plenty more experiences that I've had that are still stuck in my brain today. That home was pretty old. Older than any other place I've ever been before. This has never scared me too much though. And we ended up moving out of there pretty quick. But not until I was much in my later teens. I should actually write it like we moved in a matter of a couple days' time. Not that we moved out of that house the second we moved in. Thankfully though, we were able to sell the house. I feel like it was much more than our family could handle. Because even though I was seeing a lot of apparitions and ghosts and entities, my parents were just experiencing strange things in the house. Strange things that I believe were a direct correlation with the spirits. I'm just thankful that financially, we had the funds to escape such an experience. Okay, so this was just the other day. I stayed over at a friend's house and my friend explained to me that they have a demon in their house, living with them. I didn't believe him at first, but staying there after a couple of nights, I believe him. So I was sleeping and my friend said they were sitting on the bed, but they saw something. It was like this black figure hovering up in the ceiling. Since I'm laying in the top part of the bunk beds, my friend's dad woke up and told us that he had heard something in the house. He had a baseball bat in hand and was looking around for an intruder, but never found one. My friend just explained to me that these entities come and go as they appear, and that it's not just one demon. This one keeps trying to break into our house and do whatever it wants. It makes it sound like an intruder getting in. And at that point, I'd woken up, and the room was incredibly cold. My friend explained to me, "You know it's around when you feel a very cold draft. It's in the room right now." That night was pretty horrifying, although I never actually saw it again after that shape that was above the bed, hovering. But after a few days, I had gone home and spoke to my father about the happenings at that house. Well, he was having one of his friends over who also happened to be a pastor. And even the pastor looked at me and told me that he could feel something was off about me. I didn't really understand what he meant, because it wasn't like he could sense my emotions. It was like he explained I had something around me that was bad. Well, nothing really came of that. So that night, while I'm in my own bed, trying to doze off to sleep, I started hearing this strange voice. It sounded like somebody crying and kind of freaking out, but I couldn't make out what it was. It was very muffled. It sounded like it was coming from the back room, which is where we keep a bunch of our equipment in, like workout equipment and miscellaneous paints and supplies. My parents' room was in the other direction. I knew that other than my brother, there was nobody else in our house. So hearing this woman crying and freaking out really sent shivers down my spine. I just lay there in bed, nearly crying, after the sobbing got worse and worse, and the woman's voice was freaking out more and more. It sounded like somebody having a mental breakdown, but again, I couldn't make out the voices, or voice. I couldn't make out what was being said, but you could definitely hear the emotion in the tone. Eventually it stopped and I fell asleep. It didn't come back for a few days, and I had forgotten about it when I went to go to bed again one night, and I felt this thing come back. Except this time, I felt something enter my room. And again, I see this shape, this sort of figure that was actually blacker than the darkness around it. It kind of levitate off the ground and hover directly over my bed. And that's when I could start to make out this face. I was so freaked out that I couldn't even sleep after that. It left after a while of staring at me, and I was actually relieved, but still completely terrified and scared at the same time. I had no idea what would come next. For a few days, everything seemed fine. I didn't notice anything strange happening, until one day, something very bad happened to my friend. You see, before I go any further, I believe that when I had went over to this friend's house, whatever entity or entities were in his house, one of them had attached itself to me just by being there and came back with me. Hence the strange voices in the other room, hence it coming in my room and haunting me. But it never seemed to bother my brother, who was a little bit younger than I. I don't know why, or at least he never told me about it, never expressed any fear or mentioned it. Neither did my parents. In fact, I don't even think my dad or mom heard any of the strange noises in the back room, or at least they didn't mention it. And my family was definitely the family to always talk about stuff. But anyway, I'll continue with the story. My friend one day woke up and he felt very, very sick. Pain in and all around his body. And after going to the hospital, turns out he had developed a rapid, deadly heart condition. I don't remember what it was, but something again happened to him, and I was only 9 at the time, so I wasn't told all the details. But whatever happened to him left him paralyzed from the waist down. It wasn't like a bad car accident or anything, it was something to do with medical. And I don't know exactly if this was in part due to the demons or entities, but I believe they had a part to play. Then, after about a month later, he started having really bad breathing problems, and for a couple of moments at a time he couldn't breathe and would constantly fall unconscious. And at one point, within a few months, he had died. The cause of death was ruled as something blocking his trachea, but nothing was ever found. It was later found that he had apparently had a tumor in his trachea. I was very traumatized from it all and don't know what to think anymore. The family, very devastated, did not want to hear anything about demons or ghosts, and he was only 11 at the time. While I can't confirm that this was indeed the work of a demon or entity, I believe that they go after and target young children, and that these things had it out for him. Why? I'm not sure. God rest his soul. I still miss him. For a short period, back in the early 2000s, I was living out of my car, but had a very short window of time where I'd be living in and out of motel rooms. Well, for a very brief period of time, back in March of 2001, I was very fortunate enough to be gifted a 2-week stay in a motel room to try and get myself back on my feet. The motel room had another visitor in it, of course, a demon. To start off this story, I need to give you some background information on myself. To say I was unstable would be an understatement. At the time, my mind was playing tricks with me and my reality. I had just dealt with a very, very bad relationship, was borderline suicidal, had all sorts of addiction issues. I even got into a brief stint of gambling, had some pretty bad abuse and neglect issues and family drama. Let's just summarize it and say it was a very rough patch in my past. At the time, as I said, I was living in and out of a motel room, all alone for those 2 weeks. It was one of the cheapest motels I could find. I think it was like $40 a night, something like that, while I was trying to get my work thing figured out and just make sense of my life. I tried to be gone for most of the day, going to classes or anything I could to try and further my life and my trauma. My schedule was pretty routine. I'd get back around 8 or 9 p.m. after being gone pretty much all day and crash out, wake up about 6 to 6:30 in the morning, and rinse and repeat. But it was always around the same time every single night this entity would be there. Also to mention, every time I came back to my motel room in the evening, it would always be freezing cold. I'm talking like 50, 60 degrees, and I would always have the AC off. Plus, this was in February, March, so I would have no reason to have the AC on anyway. In fact, I would usually leave the heater on, because I wanted the room to be comfortable. I even remember calling and complaining that my heater was broken, but after 2 calls and 2 times they came out to look at it, everything was fine, and they could not understand why the room was getting so cold. You would think they would at least have the decency to have offered me a different room, but I kept hearing the same excuse every time. Sorry, all of our other rooms are already booked. Sorry. When in reality, I think it was just the front desk clerk not wanting to give me a handout, because I only ever saw at least half the motel full at any given time. I didn't buy it, but it was what it was, so I just took the cards I was dealt. But anyway, every night, right around 3 a.m., I would always hear this heavy breathing sound coming from the corner of the room, by the air conditioning unit. It sounded like somebody who had been smoking cigarettes for 80 years. Very deep breathing, very raspy, very heavy. And it was so loud, it would always wake me up out of a deep sleep. And I would find myself scanning the bedroom, looking for somebody or any intruder who had stepped in. But I'd never see anybody. But I would just hear that breathing, and it would give me the creeps. After that, I would always have a really hard time falling back asleep, like I could feel that somebody was watching me from inside the room. Although, every time I turned the lamp on, there was nothing, nobody in the room with me. The doors were locked, and no signs of anybody even trying to get in the room. I remember even one night opening the door and looking in onto the patio. There was nobody around, and you could expect anyway at about 3 a.m., in the middle of nowhere, it to be pretty dead. And it was. So, no explanation for what this breathing was. But it was almost on cue every night. At about 3 to 4 in the morning, it would wake me up. There would also be some nights too that I'd come home, and this wasn't every night, but quite often, where the room would also have this foul smell to it, like rotten eggs and trash, even though I never had any trash in the room to begin with. And the smell would not be there when I would leave in the morning, roughly about 6:30. Nobody would have come in my room, so the odor to be there would be impossible, but it smelled like there was just this giant pile of trash lying in the middle of my hotel room. And it must have been invisible or something because there was no way to trace the odor. Really, there was only maybe 1 or 2 nights out of that time in that 2-week stay there that I even felt remotely rested. I was pretty exhausted for that time there, which was a wonderful addition to the already life drama I was dealing with at the time. Now, this is where it started. After my 2-week stay there, whatever this thing was, I feel continued to follow me for several months before a couple of friends of mine, who were ex-junkies, now Christians, convinced me to start going to church and let them perform an exorcism on me, due to what they believed was demonic activity. I was agnostic at the time and pretty much didn't understand what demonic activity was. Just knew whatever this thing was following me, well, I just thought it was bad luck or maybe a dark cloud. And now that all this time has passed, I feel it's the right time more than ever to share my story, especially after being such a fan of Reddit and finding this subreddit. Hopefully this story didn't overwhelm you, and if this was too long to read, I'm very sorry. But hopefully, somebody who has had very similar experiences can read this and not feel so silly about their own things they've gone through, and know that they're not alone. There are other people out there who are not necessarily believers in ghosts and things like that this does happen to. But I'll tell you what, even though I didn't believe this stuff at the time, if you go through the right thing, it will make a believer out of you very quick. When I was little, we lived in this really old house that I would later find out that the previous owner killed himself in. And there was always really weird stuff going on in that house. I remember. I would always feel very uncomfortable especially in my room at night. And for whatever reason, it got even worse during the wintertime. That's when this entity seemed to be the most active. Whatever this thing was had attached itself to me when we had moved out. But it attached itself to me before we had even moved. I would always see it when I'd get home from school. It was creepy looking. Its dead eyes always seemed to be the same distance apart. Black, very sunken in. It was like this tall white entity. A black mouth and black eyes. I was probably about 8 years old when it first started happening, and we had moved in that house when I was about 3. And I don't recall or remember experiencing anything of the paranormal nature during that time. I think it was first when I was about 7 or 8, to be honest with you. And after a while, it stopped coming around my house. But then after a short time of being completely dead in activity, it came back in full force. In fact, every night when I'd go to bed, there it would be, lingering in my room, just staring at me from the end of my bed. This god-awful stare like it was piercing into my spirit. And one night, I just couldn't take it anymore. So I jumped up out of bed, went to go use the bathroom, and afterwards, even ran and hid in my parents' room. I didn't care if I had to sleep on the floor. I just wanted that thing to be out. My parents were utterly clueless with what to do, so they decided that when they got home from work the next day, they would take me to a local church and ask for their help, even though my family was the farthest from being religious at all. That didn't turn out very well because I can remember my dad coming back home and telling me it wasn't actual demons, and that he had spoke to a medicine man and explained that it was actually the old spirits of the house wanting us gone. He just told me not to worry about it, and eventually they would go away. On top of that, the church I had gone to wasn't very helpful, claiming they didn't do exorcisms and things of this nature, like things of paranormal, were not up their alley to deal with. Just another person who've been let down by the church. Imagine that. After a little while, I can say this, things did slowly return to normal, with really no weird things happening, until I was about 17 years old. This is when I would meet my future husband and would get pregnant. This was also right before I graduated high school. And during the entire time I was pregnant, there was really not much or if any activity at all. And even up until that point of getting pregnant, I didn't have a whole lot of activity either. There was some here and there, but I just tried to shrug it off and ignore it to the best of my ability. So, while I'm pregnant, there wasn't really anything. But I do remember one night in particular. It was right before I went to bed. The closet door in my room, which is placed directly across from my headboard, began shaking, like somebody was trying to forcefully open it. Thinking that maybe one of my siblings was messing with me, I decided to keep quiet and see what would happen next, because this has never really happened before. The closet door just kept shaking violently, for about 10 minutes straight, when all of a sudden, it just stopped, and everything got silent. I ran out of the room, pretty spooked, and decided to check up on my other siblings. I figured my youngest brother was behind all this. Nope, he was sound asleep in his bed. My older brother, who was only 3 years younger than me, was also in his bed. Now I was pretty scared after this, because I thought something was in my closet. So, after getting brave enough, I crept back in my bedroom, turning on the lights, and I opened the door. There was nothing, just my shoes and some clothes like any normal person keeps in their closet. No trace or thing of anybody ever being in my closet, at all. But yet, not even 5 minutes ago, something or somebody was just in my closet, shaking the door, trying to get it open. Although all it takes is for somebody to just hold onto the handle and pull it open. It's not like I kept it locked or anything barred up against the door to keep it from opening. I still don't know what that was all about. Was this an entity's scare tactics or something? I don't know. I try to rationalize it and think, okay, maybe something just fell over in front of the door. But again, I didn't keep anything in my closet for anything to fall. Just clothes and some shoes. I somehow wrote it off and went back to bed. And after falling asleep, that night, I remember waking up early in the morning, I couldn't tell you the time, but I remember feeling like somebody in my room was watching me. And I remember looking up towards my window, and I could see this black shadow with eyes staring at me from outside. I remember screaming and ducking my head under my pillow, just wishing, praying it would go. I think it eventually did, and I never checked. I think I just fell asleep. But I felt like I couldn't breathe as it was staring back at me for what felt like an eternity. Other than that account, there wasn't really much going on in my pregnancy until the baby came. That's when a whole other host of things really started to pick up. I had never truly experienced real poltergeist activity until this point. As soon as the birth of my son happened, everything went up about 12 notches. Activity around the house exploded, and I felt that there was more than one entity watching me at all times. At nighttime, my son would scream and scream at random points in the night, like he was being hurt by something. There were even points when he was about 2 or 3 months old that he would have these terrible scratch marks all along the bottoms of his feet and legs. Even though we have no pets, cats, and it would be virtually impossible for that to happen, since he slept in bed with me. Luckily, they never seemed to bother him, but it looked like something was scratching him. That doesn't include all the other noise and sounds we would hear at night, or the cold drafts of air that would suddenly just blow up into the room. And this ever-lingering feeling of fear following you around wherever you'd go in the house. Shortly after my son was born, my husband, whom I got married to very quickly after the baby, who was also the baby's father, moved in with me. We were 19 and 17 at the time, and I was just about to turn 18. We lived with my parents and my 2 younger brothers, and we would stay there for about a year until we would save up just enough money to move into our own apartment in the following summertime. And it was in that year that things went absolutely crazy. Even my husband, who had never got a taste of the paranormal, got more than his fill. He claims that one night, when he was stepping out of the room to go get something to drink from the fridge, something came down the hall at him and grabbed hold of his arms and tried to force him down to the ground, like it was tackling him or something. He screamed and began rushing back to the bedroom. Of course, I was exhausted with the baby, but he told me he didn't sleep at all that night and was exhausted for work the next day. Later on that evening, he showed me he had these red marks on his arms where this thing gripped him and held him down. It looked like somebody had held his arms really, really hard, enough to cause bruising on the actual surface of his skin. He said those parts of his arms were sore for at least a week after. And another time, we were all sleeping, and I think this was closer to Christmas, and we heard the loud sound of something shattering in the living room. All of us, including my husband and my parents, got up to see what it was. I think we thought somebody was breaking in, but there was nothing. No signs of anything being misplaced or broken at all. We had no idea where the sounds had come from, but it sounded like something large had shattered right here on the wooden floor. It was things like this that would happen over and over and over again. And finally, come July of the following year, my son is now about 9-10 months old, and my husband and I had found this little apartment about 10 minutes away. We promptly moved out as quickly as we could now that we had finally had enough money. After we moved out into our own apartment, things really seemed to die down for us. In fact, I don't really remember any activity at all, to be honest with you. But my parents' house stayed very lively in the spirit realm. Activity wasn't as bad as when me and my husband and my son were there, but things were still pretty wild. In fact, even my father claims that one of these entities came in their room at night and spoke to my father, physically spoke to him, and explained to him it was going to kill him. My father, completely terrified, ended up getting a hold of a Catholic priest, having him come to the house, bless the house, pray over the house, all the usual exorcist stuff. And I think activity kind of dimmed down a bit after that. I don't really remember too much. And I think within the next few years, they ended up selling the house and moving down into a smaller house because one of my brothers was going off to college, and I think my other brother had actually moved out and was staying with a friend. He was actually having a lot of drug problems at the time and was stealing from my parents, so I think they had kicked him out for the time being. Anyway, long story short, all the activity remained in that house, and I feel sorry for whoever bought that place, because I'm sure it got passed on to them. Like many other strange paranormal experiences, my family and I lived in a very old house growing up. But for some reason, I always felt that our old house was very incredibly haunted. You could just tell by the feeling. And one room that I never recall feeling safe in was the attic. It always felt really bad up there, like there was something up there watching over your shoulder. Although I had gone up there multiple times to help my father load and unload stuff, because we kept it as a storage place, and we would never see anything. In fact, I don't even think my dad ever noticed, but I do. And I remember one day finding an old wooden Ouija board up there. We got rid of it, but it was creepy. Many other creepy things happened in that house, like hearing voices of people talking in other rooms when you knew that nobody was there, having these random chills go up your spine, and this overwhelming, unmistakable feeling of dread, like something really bad was about to happen. One time, I had woke up suddenly right around 2 a.m. I remember it was a Saturday morning, and I thought I heard people fighting, physically fighting up in the attic, like an actual full-on brawl. I thought for a second maybe it was my parents, but they were asleep. And where my room was, down the hallway, it was right above part of the attic. And so all the commotion was going around partially in the hallway and partially right above my bedroom. And then all of a sudden, the sounds in the attic just instantaneously stop, and my door flies wide open. I jump up almost out of bed, expecting to see somebody come into my room, but there was nothing. So I shined my light and looked, and nobody was there. But one creepy thing I remember noticing is that just beyond my door, the attic was open, and the ladder that comes down to get up to the attic was down, meaning somebody was either up in the attic or had come down from the attic. I was too scared to even go see, so I jump up out of bed, go run over, slam my door shut, pull my dresser over, and put it in front of the door, so nobody can get in. You bet I was too scared to go over and close the attic. I have no idea if something was up there. I didn't want to know. It took me a long while to fall asleep after that, but all the fighting sounds above in the attic had completely stopped. I have no idea who or what was up there, and that was probably one of the scariest incidents I can remember pretty vividly happening in that same house. Luckily for me, or for my family I guess, within about 4 years, we ended up selling the house. My parents had gotten into a pretty bad financial situation, and so we moved into an apartment where I would live till the end of high school. I'm now 32 years old, and I'm very thankful that I don't deal with these anymore, not like I used to. Oh, and one other time, I forgot to mention this. This was, I think, only months before we were trying to move out. I think I was trying to fall asleep, and I remember this night I was very restless. Usually, I'm a pretty heavy sleeper. I fall asleep very quickly, and I've never been one to ever have problems falling asleep. I've always been that way. In fact, I still am. But I would hear these deep growling noises coming from somewhere in the house. It was like a big dog, but deeper and more scarier sounding. And it would get louder and louder, and the walls would start to rattle a little bit, and then it would stop. And then it would just suddenly stop and be done. Then it would start back up again. And after about an hour of this, I finally got tired and I remember screaming, "Show yourself, or I will kill you." Or something along those lines. I don't exactly remember. Being 12 years old and super edgy, I was just tired and felt like I could take on anything. I wasn't even afraid anymore. I was just tired of the torment. But that was it for that night. I didn't hear any more growling sounds. I figured it was just some spirit trying to mess with me. There were other nights too where I would hear yelling and footsteps running away really fast. I'm pretty sure I had some sort of poltergeist in my home. But I'm also open to any ideas that anybody could let me in on. I would also just like to add that when I was a kid, growing up in that house for the short time I did, I always knew for some reason that somebody or something was watching out for us at all the time. In life, and maybe even in death. I keep my mother's picture on my wall, with a lit candle underneath it. I believe she watches over us from heaven, protecting us wherever we go. I believe that whatever this entity or entities or poltergeist or ghosts or spirits, whatever they were also watching over our family, in a bad way. And for some reason, these things had attached themselves to this house. So my last question is, do you think that all entities are necessarily bad? I know that sounds strange, but I feel like this spirit was attached to that house. This specific one. I believe it could have been a very dangerous entity, and I believe had it not been for my guardian angel watching over me, it could have done a lot more damage. Thank you for reading, and take care. Our family that had owned a home for the majority of my daughter's life, which we eventually sold about 12 years ago now. From the time that my daughter was very young, she would always complain about monsters being in her room, and they would scare her very badly. I never knew to what degree, but I always just thought it was her being a little kid. I never knew she was actually seeing poltergeists and entities. When I talked to her, she claims that it started when she was little. This is the story she told me of her hauntings from being very little. When she would be sleeping in her bed, she'd wake up and see these shadows. She would describe them as very tall, with large and long short arms and legs. They would always be kind of hiding behind the bed, she explained. She said that when she was younger, she knew that they weren't anything good. And she remembers waking up one night and having one of these entities be pulling the blankets off of her towards the end of the bed. She didn't know what they were exactly, but felt scared about them, that whatever was in her room with her was not good. It was as she got a little bit older that everything seemed to completely turn sour. While we were never a family that had incredibly terrifying hauntings and demonic manifestations, we seemed to get hit with a stream of bad luck. During these 4 years that we were in that house, my father got diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. My wife had completely lost her job due to her company being sued. My brother had passed away due to a bad car crash. My wife's mother had committed suicide. My oldest son had a very bad accident and was paralyzed from the waist down. It was just like one thing after the other, and it all started once we moved in this house. I don't know if there's some sort of evil energy that attaches itself to people once it knows who it wants to target, but that's what it felt like. And I can vividly remember at night, because the way our bedroom was and the way the house was laid out, our bedroom was closest to the front door. I would always hear the front door rattling really heavily at night, like somebody was trying their darndest to break in. Although there was nobody out. All I had to do was look at my window, and I could see the front porch, and the porch light was always on. The door would be violently rattling and pressing like somebody was really trying to get in. But I'm looking out and I don't see a soul out there. But the door is visibly shaking and moving, and the handle is rattling. I shudder to even think about what would happen had the door been unlocked and not deadbolted. I even remember about 3 weeks. My daughter had got very, very sick. I want to say it was the flu, but I don't know what it was. We had taken her to the hospital on multiple occasions, but she ended up coming out of it. After about 4 or 5 years, I think my wife and I had come to the conclusion that everything was because of this house. I know that sounds silly of a conclusion to come to, but we were desperate, grieving, and emotionally exhausted. We were hoping that this change would somehow make a positive change in our lives. We sold the place and ended up buying a house completely out of town, far away from this one. And luckily for us, things started to change for the better. I had just gained a new job as management, and our life seemed to be turning around for the better. Sorry for this being so short, but those are my experiences. My really only experiences dealing with a haunted house. I grew up on a large farm, previously owned by this older man who had passed away many years ago, in the early 1970s. I can remember as a kid playing outside by the large barn, and I would sometimes see his ghost. It always scared me. However, he would always just appear as this white, translucent apparition. He never seemed to notice me, and I eventually just stopped being scared of it altogether. But my parents even began to notice the old farmer out there sometimes, so they knew something strange was going on. Well, just recently, 2021 recently, my family had decided to sell our farmhouse. They were going through a lot of financial hardship, especially after COVID and the pandemic and having a bunch of issues. It was about time to let it go. So, my father, getting a good offer on the place, sold it within just a couple of weeks. It felt like a huge relief to get away from that place, but we had some very bad memories there as a family unit, but also some good ones. And I think my parents really grew an attachment to that farm. Sure, we had the ghost thing, but there was also this lovely old rustic charm to it, because that guy never really updated much of the farm. And I don't know his name. I'll have to check with my parents. They remember it. It's in documentation somewhere. So it's really a big loss for them. And I think they kind of just got used to seeing the old farmer ghost after a while. But besides all that, I do have some memories of being in that old farmhouse. For example, I remember when I was probably about 11 or 12, I woke up in the middle of the night to this odd feeling that somebody or something was watching me, directly in my own bedroom. So I got up and walked around and found nothing at all. It was probably just some weird sense of paranoia, right? Well, about a week later, this happened again. I'd woken up in the middle of the night for seemingly no reason at all, except this time, while looking around my bedroom, not seeing anything yet again. I looked right outside through my open window into our backyard, and I see this old man staring right at me. You could probably imagine how shocked I was that I was seeing this ghost again. It really spooked me, but I had to remember and tell myself it's just the old friendly ghost of the farmer. There was never any negative feelings or bad energy around him. In fact, I don't really remember feeling much, other than just being scared at the sight of him. But he always seemed to just keep to himself. If that even makes sense, I mean, do ghosts even keep to themselves? Or are they simply just eternally living out their last days of what they did on Earth? That's what he seemed to do. Of course, as I got older, my sightings of him became less and less. But, like most preteens and teenagers, I was also home a lot less and less. I spent a lot more time at my friends and parties and spending the night at girls' houses. And sometimes boys, if I was allowed and my parents didn't know. And I don't really remember ever seeing him during high school. It was mainly when I was a kid and I was out playing by the barn in the old tool shed. And being a teenager, I had no reason to ever go out there. That's where my father kept a lot of the old equipment and farm equipment. Things for dealing with the garden and all that stuff. Never had a reason to go out there, never had an interest to. For all I know, maybe that's where the ghost still showed himself. I moved out for college right after high school, and when I got out of college, I had already been working, so I immediately moved into an apartment with a couple of roommates for about a year or two and then bought my own home. So my time back at this old farmhouse was really rare, sporadic, and not much at all. I would go and visit my family on holidays, but never staying more than a night or two. And again, never seeing this old farmer ghost again. I bet he was a sweet old man when he was alive. That's probably the feeling I would imagine getting from him if he was real and not dead. But I hope my story proves that not all paranormal stories have to be scary. I think some spirits are just curious and are just stuck living out their last days of whatever they did here on Earth, like this old farmer. In fact, I think had I spent more time out there and probably saw him more often, he'd probably just not bother me. I mean, he never did. He never did pay attention to me. It was always me who was scared by seeing him. I mean, and rightfully so. I think just about anybody would be scared by seeing any apparition. I'm just going to come out and flat out say it. Don't play with Ouija boards. You're not doing anybody a favor. In fact, you're actually putting yourself at risk. I thought back when, I was just some stupid kid, and the whole Ouija board thing, it was just fun and games and laughs. Until my friends and I got together one night at his house and played it. The things we experienced afterwards, and the downfall our lives took after this, I wholeheartedly believe it was because of this board. It was like some sort of cloud of bad luck. I've since moved away and haven't dealt with it much, but even years after, there have still been things popping up here and there. Look, I'm sure you're no stranger to the dangers of Ouija boards, but please, allow me to share my story. It was the summer of 2012. I did not have much going on at the time. On my 18th birthday, though, my friends threw me a party, and one of them had mentioned he had found an old Ouija board in his basement. It had probably been there for a while. He told me he thinks it was his grandparents', but he wasn't quite sure. Anyway, we should come over and have a Ouija board fun at his house. Since he'd brought it to the party, we could all, of course, be curious and play it. So, we had the party. It was me and a few friends, including him, and we set it up around his dining room table. We turned off all the lights, lit probably about 9 or 10 candles, and we started asking it all sorts of questions. We all put our hands on the planchet, began asking all sorts of weird stuff. And keep in mind, before all this, we thought Ouija boards were a joke. We didn't think the whole spirit realm thing was real. We didn't think hauntings, demons, ghosts, entities, none of that was real. It was all just a joke. Until we started asking some serious questions. That's when it started to move. Because the first couple times, nothing happened. And my friend, whose the board belonged to his grandparents, he just started laughing. See guys, I told you this was some sort of joke. Until my friend yells out loud, "I want to talk to a spirit. I command you to come out of this board and speak to us." And immediately, with all of our hands on the planchet, it slowly moved over to yes. And now he's kind of nervously laughing, looking up at me and looking back down at the board, thinking, yeah, very funny, good one. And I'm kind of wide-eyed looking back at him saying, I'm not doing that, are you guys? And of course, my other two friends are kind of scared too because, like us, they think it's all a joke, but they realize there's something going on here. Judging by all of our reactions, none of us are moving this planchet. And I remember saying to him, I think we got a bite. Why don't you ask it something that it would have to know to prove what it is? So my friend kind of gets a grin and says, okay. So he asks, how many people are here in the room right now? And the planchet slowly spells out 4, which was correct. It was just me, my friend, and my 2 other friends. That's when we started to get really creeped out. My friend asked it, okay, tough guy, what's my name then? And it spelt out R-A-Y, Ray, which was his real name, but he always went by his middle name, David. So that really freaked him out. I just remember seeing the blood drain from his face. I think it was in that moment he really knew we were speaking to an actual being or something. Speaking of which, I was also the only one out of us 4 besides him who knew that. My other 2 friends were more mutual friends with Ray, and they did not know him like I did. So I thought it was my turn. My friend, who's clearly scared, looks at me and says, all right, birthday boy, why don't you ask it something that only you know? And I did. Nobody else in my friend circle here knew my grandmother or her birth date, which, by the way, was October 18th, 1941. And I asked it, tell me the day and year my grandmother Sadie was born. And just like everything else, the planchet slowly moved to spell out October 16th, 1941. I literally let go of the planchet, pulling my hand back. Now I'm too freaked out. How on earth does it know that? Is it reading my thoughts? And my friends see me retract my hand quickly and get up from the table, looking at me like, no way, did it guess it right? I just looked at all of them and nodded my head yes. And now they're all freaking out too. And my friend Ray is like, man, you gotta come sit back down. We gotta finish this. And at this point, I am very reluctant to be involved in this board. I feel like already this has gone way too far and I have hit my limit. So he's begging me, please sit back down. Please. So after some coaxing, he finally gets me to sit back down, but I don't put my hand on the planchet. I don't want to be involved in this anymore. I'm too freaked out. A note I should include here is that my grandma Sadie, whom I was very close with, passed away back in 1998 of emphysema. She was a very, very heavy smoker. This will come in importance for later. So my friend, Ray, determined to find out who exactly we're talking to, asked the board, "What spirit are we speaking to? Tell us your name." The planchet paused for a moment and began slowly going over the letters. Z-O, Z-O. Stopping. Zozo? My friends laughed, and what kind of name is Zozo? Within a minute, I don't even think a minute, several glasses in the cupboard shattered all by themselves. And since we were already on high alert and edge, it made all of us jump 50 feet into the air off our chairs, looking around, flipping on each light switch, thinking, who the heck is that? And so the shattering had come from his mother's china cabinet. Very old, antique glasses, 6 of them in total, just shattered on their own. There was no wind, there was nobody over there. Literally zero reason why these 6 glasses should have shattered in unison. They had been untouched for so long, you could practically see the dust lining them from the china cabinet. And his parents were also gone, so we were the only ones in his house. I think that was enough for us that night. We all got up, blew out the candles, turned the light on, and closed the board. That was probably the scariest thing. The scariest birthday party. The scariest sleepover friend hangout, whatever you want to call it, I've had. My friend Ray just closed the board up and put it in a box and stuck it back against the wall. We didn't really say much about it, but I think we were all thinking the same thing. We should probably go, it's getting late now. And as we all left, just this lingering feeling of being so unsettled and like something wasn't quite right lingered within us. The next day at school, I meet up with Ray and he looks awful, like he has not slept at all. And he pulls me aside and says, "I gotta tell you something." And so I'm looking at him like, "Yeah, tell me." He explains that last night, when he went to bed, this demon or shadow appeared in his room and almost choked him out. And that it was growling at him and had these red eyes and almost caused him to die. He said it felt like it had tremendous force and was crushing his trachea, that he couldn't breathe, and that just as he was almost passing out from lack of oxygen, it let go and vanished. Completely terrified, he runs out to the living room and tries to sleep on the couch. But he told me he kept hearing growling sounds all night, from the hallway and from the kitchen, and that he could just feel this thing's presence around the house. Well, about a couple months from now, or after this, Ray, who has been very clean, never drank, did drugs, a pretty straight kid, started getting into heroin. I don't know how, I don't know why, but his personality began drastically changing to this depressive, sad, dark persona, a side of Ray that I never knew, because again, he was this happy, upbeat, clean kid, the life of the party, so to speak, and not a bad influence at all. That wasn't his family, that wasn't any part of any of his family, actually. And yet now he had turned into this avatar of himself that I did not recognize. He stopped showing up at school, stopped answering his phone, and became really hard to contact. He would slowly and slowly drop out of my life over the course of the following 6 to 8 months. Which, by the way, he was a really close friend of mine in middle school and in high school. I remember going over to his house and talking with his parents, expressing my concern that I hadn't seen him in days. His parents were also worried, saying the same thing. Police had been called for truancy, and they too could not find him. I guess as we found out that he would actually be gone going on these long drug benders, and be gone for 3, 4, 5 days at a time. How he was getting the money for all the heroin and whatever drugs and substances he was doing, we have no idea. But I remember hearing from his parents after a while that he ended up going to the hospital, the psyche hospital, and was trying to cut himself and do all sorts of crazy things, speaking in tongues and spitting blood at people. I guess at one point or another, he had taken a razor blade and cut off half his tongue, and then cauterized it with a lighter. Just things that would prove that he was just out of his mind. One of my other friends, who was there with us during the Ouija board session, dropped out of high school and moved away, so I don't exactly know what happened to him. But from the little I remember, is he had some sort of family emergency or trauma that he had to attend to, and the next thing you know, he had dropped out, and I didn't see anything more of him. I wasn't as close with him. He was just one of those at-school friends that you would kind of see and hang out. Now the other friend, whom I'll mention as Tyler, obviously that's not his real name, but we'll call him Tyler for the story. Tyler had broken his knee really, really badly, probably about 2 weeks after this incident with the Ouija board. Or maybe it was his shin. I'm trying to remember. But he was heavily into sports, and this was while he was not practicing sports, so it's not like he just had a freak accident. But I'm trying to remember how he broke his leg, but it caused him to be out for a little while. And then the next thing I hear is that he's addicted to opioids. Again, Tyler, another very straight-edge kid, clean and innocent as a whistle, never even had a girlfriend before. And I don't remember anything necessarily really bad happening to Tyler. It's just, I think he went his own way and I went my own way. And after high school, we just lost total connection, so I don't know what happened to him. But as high school ended, Ray and I still talked, but it was very infrequent. This was after his whole drug binge in the hospital and cutting off half his tongue, and he continued to get more strange. He shaved his entire head and tattooed this dragon from his neck all the way to the top of his skull, and he would refer to it as the blood dragon. And he would always say things like, "The blood dragon wants its sacrifice," which I just thought he was out of his mind. I had no idea what he was talking about. I figured the heroin had just really messed him up. In fact, even after high school, the conversations we would have were just out there. They didn't really make much sense, and my talks with him were very sporadic. They never lasted long. And I think the last time I talked to him was probably that August or September following high school. Whereas the previous year, we were best buddies. We were hanging out all summer, talking about girls and all things that teenage boys talk about. And that following summer, after the Ouija board event in the spring, he was just an entirely different person. Wouldn't really tell me about nothing, and every time we tried to talk, he just would not make any sense. Even if I tried to ask him questions or start conversation, this was not the same Ray I knew. And after he kind of just dropped off the face of the earth right around September, I get a call from his father right around early December. He had gotten killed in a drug deal. As heartbreaking news as that was to hear, the Ray I knew and loved had been long gone for a long time. Now, before I end this story, let me talk to you a little bit about what happened to me during this whole time. So, while all this stuff is going on with Tyler and my other friend, and of course Ray, I was having some strange experiences and really vivid nightmares at home. I remember dreaming that this figure would come out of my closet. Not like a monster, but this giant black shape would just crawl out of my closet and chase me down the hallway. This was a reoccurring nightmare, just about every single night, after the Ouija board incident. I remember some nights waking up and smelling the foul odor of cigarette smoke. And in fact, one night, I remember waking up and hearing this deathly loud coughing noise, like somebody hacking up their lungs, and, of course, the cigarette smell. It was pretty strong. So strong the smell would wake me from my sleep. Of course, I knew this was impossible. Nobody in my home smoked cigarettes. I lived in a pretty normal urban neighborhood. There was no cigarette smoke coming into my room, and after flicking on my lights, you could tell there was no smoke in the air, but yet the odor lingered. And that coughing noise, it sounded like somebody hacking away, like an old woman or something. It was very, very strange, and so this went on for weeks at a time. Not every single night, but often enough. And I remember, one day, sitting at the table and my mom was saying, "Honey, I think Sadie was paying us a visit last night." And I remember that name catching my attention because the last time I even mentioned her was at that Ouija board party. And I'm like, "What do you mean?" And she says, "You didn't hear the hacking last night, did you? I think old Grandma Sadie was coming back to watch over us. I even smelt the smoke." I didn't really respond to her, and the conversation changed. But her saying that to me confirmed that I was not crazy. My speculation now, after all these years, is that the demon had come out of the board, terrorized Ray and my two other friends, but maybe because I pulled my hand away from the planchet, it couldn't really attach itself to me. I don't really know. But maybe, just maybe, because I gave it information about Sadie, not the smoking part, but that I mentioned her name and the time and date that she was born. Maybe this demon Zozo was trying to, I don't know, imitate her. Because when I would wake up and hear that coughing and smell the cigarette smoke, I never had a bad feeling per se. It wasn't like somebody was in the room with me or that somebody was watching me. It sounded like somebody coughing who was a bad smoker, and the smell, like somebody was huffing a pack of cigarettes and then room over. But again, that's all speculation, and this all stopped come at the end of May, right around when I graduated. So I don't know how much of that is demon related. I don't know how much of that is just my own thing, but it definitely freaked me out. Now, as I would get older, I would spend some more time trying to research the whole Ouija board phenomenon and the demon by the name of Zozo. Well, to my luck, come to find out that Zozo is a very popular demon who's very dangerous and often comes to talk to people through Ouija boards. He can wreak havoc on people's lives, doing things that all sorts of people wish they would have never experienced. And I wholeheartedly believe that he possessed Ray and destroyed his life, causing him to go mad, dive into drugs and steal and live the life that he never would ever do, all because of a stupid Ouija board. I know that people who are knowledgeable about boards know that it's not a joke, and that you need to be extra careful, because you are inviting spirits to come into your life and attach themselves to you, meaning that they have full power to do whatever they want to. And if you get a malevolent spirit, or in this case a demon like Zozo, don't expect anything good to happen. How I was seemingly spared from all the terrible, horrendous things that happened, I don't know. But maybe this was all just one big massive coincidence, and the board and Zozo were just a figment of our imaginations. Maybe I'll let you be the judge of this. But I had one last thing that really bothered me down to my soul. And this was long after everything. And I don't know if this was Zozo, or who was this, or what. Maybe it was somebody pranking me, I don't know. But I'll leave you with this. Now, this was probably about 4 months after I got the phone call from Ray's father, letting me know he had passed. So I think it was March or April the following year. About a year's time after the first Ouija board incident, I get a call from a private number in the middle of the night. I look over, don't answer it, and I'm thinking, if it's important, they'll leave a voicemail. Well, I fall back asleep, and the next thing you know, I had a voicemail from that number. I want you to understand that I never get phone calls from private numbers. And so I decide to listen to the voicemail, and I nearly drop my phone. I listen to the voicemail, and it's a bunch of static in the background, and it's Ray's voice, but it sounds kind of crackly and distorted, as if like something is trying to imitate his voice. That's just the way I perceived it. It would fluctuate in pitch, but it said quite simply, and I'll never forget it. "I'm in hell, Seth. It hurts down here. Why don't you come and talk to me through the board? I'm sure it's still at Ray's house." And I literally threw my phone across the wall, thinking I was having some sort of manic episode. I deleted the voicemail, I deleted the number, and I never received another call like that since. So I don't know if that was Zozo messing with me, or if it was maybe the demon trying to invite me to go use the board again. I don't know. I apologize in advance for the extremely long story. But if I could leave you with anything, it's please be careful what you do with these entities. I know the dangers that might come if somebody does not take them seriously, like we did. And if you made it this far in the story, thank you so much for taking the time to read. It's taken me a long time to write this up and look back on these memories. It's still hard for me to think about, and even harder for me to write down. But I am safe to say that I do not deal with any of these things anymore, and that thankfully, everything I dealt with is in the past. I would consider myself a pretty spiritual person. I'm not exactly religious, but I do believe in the spirit realm. I've had multiple experiences with demons, especially when I was younger. I'm currently 18, and I don't know if it's the internet making me think these things or maybe they really are real. First time, it was late, and I remember looking out my windows. There were many trees around, blocking the light from the moon, but there were a couple that seemed to be moving by themselves. It looked to be something big, shaking them, moving them all around. This set off all the alarms in my head, telling me not to look. So I simply told myself, that's enough looking for now, and shut my curtains. But as soon as I did that, I started hearing one of these trees start shaking violently, banging against the side of our house. This really freaked me out, so I just sat there, at the end of my bed, looking out into our hallway, as if the noises were going to come in the house. I was convinced some large winged, horned demon was out there, trying to get my attention, wanting to actually get in the house and do God only knows what. The second time, my family had a big house in Southern California, around many other houses. We also had 2 cats, one being very old and very sickly, which we found a month or so ago abandoned. The other is a young, hyperactive kitten who loves to play. So, our pets were alone for a long time, and we decided to leave them home together when we went away for a weekend. We came back. Both animals were found dead, drowned, it looked like, as both their bodies were floating in the pool, even though they were locked in the house. And when we checked, there were no signs the doors were ever opened, so how they got outside is beyond us. My belief is that the entity in our house let these cats out and drowned them, but I'll get to that in just a second. The third time was when my father was little. He would play outside in his own backyard, and he would hear people talking behind him in hushed tones and whispers, except he would turn around and nobody would be there. He tried to tell his parents, but they never believed him. They thought he was just hearing things and making them up. So, whenever he heard people ever talking behind him, he just gained this sense of paranoia that did not work in his favor. Well, I think it transferred. Whatever entity was haunting him. One day, when I was probably about 7 or 8, I kept hearing these strange voices calling out to me from behind our pool in our backyard. I ignored it at first because it wasn't anything really discernible. Random voices. But over time, the voices changed and got weird. I remember one time, my name was being called, and another it was this little girl voice, yelling, "Don't leave me, don't leave me," over and over. But the tone was angry, and then would switch to being playful. 8-year-old me was very disturbed and confused by all of this, and I thought some little girl was being left out in the woods, but there was nobody ever back there. My mom, who is very in touch with her native spiritual side, claims that she feels spirits are in our backyard and are in our house. She's never really hinted at if they're negative or positive, but just that spirits in the spiritual realm are brimming all around our home. For the record, my mom is half Irish, half Choctaw, and is pretty in roots and close with her Choctaw family. Her belief is that all of these experiences go back to this entity that has gotten in our home. So, out of the 3 stories I shared with you, I have no idea why it is that I'm experiencing these things now, and even more so at the age I am. Is it possible that these are all just maybe coincidences, or are they really a spiritual matter? Maybe I do have something to do with it. Maybe, just maybe, that these entities have attached themselves to my father and are now being transferred over to me. And my mom, being a part of the Choctaw culture, transfers over some of her own negative energy and spirits that have attached themselves to her. Thanks for reading. This was back in the late 80s. I was in college. My roommate, which I would learn later on, had been secretly practicing black magic for years, in secrecy, but he never ended up telling me. This is important, because it all started one night, and I went to bed like everything was normal. I'd woken up in the middle of the night to feel something slowly touching my hand, moving its motion up my arm. Something big, coming out of the darkness. It felt very real and physical, not like a dream at all. I mean, it was an actual physical sensation I could feel, like an actual person who, by the way, was very, very cold, slowly moving their fingers and hands at my body. Like actually somebody stroking my fingers, with pressure and everything. But when I opened my eyes in reaction to the sensation, there was only darkness. And somehow, I fell asleep, again. But it was like this paralysis sleep, like the opposite of sleep paralysis when you're awake. I was full on asleep, but I felt as though I had no movement, or could control my own body while sleeping, if that makes sense at all. And I remember having this really vivid dream like I was spinning, and nothing made sense. And in my dream, I recall having these horrible hallucinations, and recognizing in my own dream or nightmare that I was having these horrible hallucinations. I frantically woke up out of sleep, trying to calm myself down, but was never able to sleep the rest of the night. I thought it was just a really bad nightmare. My roommate is kind of strange, keeps to himself, but he will talk to me sometimes. He actually sleeps out on the couch more than the living room. So I'd come out there and I saw him sleeping there. And I told him, "Hey, did you by any chance experience anything strange last night?" And he looks at me and asks inquisitively. I told him that somebody was touching my hand, and he immediately realized what had happened. He just explained to me, when you make contact with the other side, that's how people experience it, by having physical contact with an entity, or the dark world, he called it. Of course, I wasn't quite sure what he was getting at because I knew for a fact I made no physical contact with the other side. And I never did tell him about my vivid nightmares, just that one event. We stayed roommated for another 8 months or so before he moved out. And during that time, this entity, or being, would keep coming back. In fact, one night, I remember, I woke up to this being pinning me down on the bed. Not having its way with me or anything, just physically holding me down, restraining my arms and legs, getting right up in my face and growling, like a monster or something, completely scared and terrified out of my mind. I was unsure how to handle it, so I just began praying silently, praying aloud, doing whatever I could to get this being away from me. Well, it worked, to an extent. This being let go of my wrists, let go of my ankles, slowly climbed up off the bed, and just walked out of the room. This had happened several more times just like this over the course of the following months. Sometimes it would crouch in my room and just watch me as I slept. Other times it would kind of hover above my bed. But I don't recall ever waking up in a sleep paralysis. It was either looking at me in my room where I had full control over my entire physical being, or it was actually physically restraining me with this massive amounts of supernatural strength, and it felt ice cold. Like it was like standing next to an industrial freezer door that was open. So cold and bitter. I would come to find out later on that my roommate was probably the cause of this entity, inviting them in the house, through spells and all other sorts of magic that he practiced. If you're going to ask me, I couldn't tell you exactly what he practiced. I just knew it was magic of some kind, and it sounds like the dark kind, because he always made references to contacting the dark world, and having control over dark things. Maybe he was a hobbyist practitioner, I don't know, I don't really care. But last I heard, he actually died back in 2003. And this was right around the mid to late 90s. 96, 97 is when we were roommating together. I just hope that this story gets some exposure. It deserves to help people understand that it's normal for people to have paranormal experiences when they sleep and when they're awake, especially during the nighttime. For whatever reason, entities really enjoy haunting you when it's at night. They adore the darkness. They like the concealment. Although I'm pretty sure that there is a wide amount of stories that take place during the daytime. And seeing entities and paranormal beings are not just exclusive to night. but it seems to be when they are most active. There's just something about the darkness. So if you're reading this, and you yourself have had something similar to me, know you are not alone. Know that there are many others like you that have gone through a very similar thing. Back when I was out of college, I moved into a small house outside of a smaller town, more tucked into the mountains. This was in Colorado State. I was acquaintances with the guy who sold it to me for very cheap. He had owned it for quite a while and was looking to upgrade his living situation. Since we knew each other, only by a little bit, he had asked me if he'd be willing to buy it from me, since he knew I was single, had just graduated, and was looking for something small that would take care of just me. Stupid me, I took his word for it, without checking it out first. I moved in the beginning of November, just as it began snowing. I remember having no real issues with the house at first. It was small and I found suited my needs well. Remember, I was just a single guy living by myself at the time. I didn't need much, until the first time I'd gone downstairs and investigated the basement. Now keep in mind, up to this point, I had barely anything with me, barely even any furniture, so I never even checked out the basement, ever. The only thing down there to my knowledge was the breaker box, I think, and possibly a spare bathroom, none of which I ever used. So it was probably the first week I ended up going down there, and made a horrifying discovery. On the walls in the basement were all kinds of symbols that appeared to be written in red, which I would later find out were not paint, by the way. It was actually blood. It was awful having to clean that up, but I couldn't understand what these symbols were. I thought it was graffiti at first and was pissed that the guy did not tell me about this stuff, that he left this for me. But because I didn't want to start any drama or confrontation, I just left it at that and spent a few hours cleaning it all up. Now, life would return to normal for the most part. I remember I took a small job at a restaurant not too far away in town, where I met a girl whom I started dating with, and our relationship would last for about 2 years. While I lived at this house, her and I dated, and I would have her over often. And I think one night, we're sitting there watching TV and I told her about what had gone on in my basement. She insisted on going down to look for herself. And after coming back upstairs, she had this really strange look on her face. She was pale and kind of sweaty and clammy. I asked her if she was okay, and she told me that she was suddenly not feeling very well and she needed to go home. So I kissed her goodbye and, well, off she went. Afterwards, she seemed very hesitant and reluctant to come back. Like every time I'd ask her if she wanted to come hang out at my place, she got really nervous and very fidgety, would stutter a bunch, and would always have excuses why she couldn't come over. I thought this was incredibly strange. And after enough poking and prodding, I found out from her that she saw something down in the basement that really scared her. At first, when I poked and prodded enough, she convinced me all up and down that if she told me, I was not going to believe her. But I convinced her, hey, look, I walked into my own basement with this weird stuff all over the walls. You can tell me. I'll believe you. She told me that she saw an entity down in the basement. The word she used was a demon, or ghost. I can't remember which. And that it was standing there in the basement. And as she went down there to look, it turned around to see her and began to run towards her, reaching out to her to try and grab her. Which would explain why she was running back up the stairs and looked very pale, now that I thought about it. I didn't really have much to say after she told me that, but figured I'd get a few second and third opinions, so I invited a couple of friends that I had made at the restaurant over to the house and see what they thought. We would all go down to the basement together, and I will say, having not been down here in a few weeks since cleaning up all those weird symbols on the wall, the basement felt incredibly eerie. It was a pretty typical basement. Concrete flooring, brick, a few paint cans here in the corner, the circuit breaker box, and I think a couple of empty 10-gallon buckets, insulation in the corner, and a couple of other paintbrushes and some miscellaneous supplies, but pretty much empty. My friend immediately notes that he kind of just gets the creeps down here. He feels like there's somebody down here with us. He asked us if I roommated with anybody. I told him no, it was just me. And I remember he kind of just walks around and shakes his head and says, "Yeah, man, somebody else is here with you. I can tell." Which confused me, and I asked him, "What do you mean somebody is? What does that even mean?" He looks at me stern and just says, "It feels like there is somebody else down in this basement with us. You can sense it. I'm not a ghost guy, but I could feel the presence of somebody else here. And it feels very uncomfortable, not very inviting. Let's go back upstairs." We go back upstairs and we start debating on what we think it could be. I'm new to the idea of ghosts and hauntings, so this was all new for me. In fact, I don't think I really knew anything about the paranormal, and either did one of my friends, the same one that came with me today. But after we had dinner and he left, I couldn't help but think the rest of the night, what was in my house? And it was that night, I'm pretty sure, as I'm lying there in bed, I start hearing banging and clanging down in the basement, like somebody's throwing some heavy stuff around, like somebody had a big hammer and they were banging around. It kept me up quite late, and to be honest with you, I was simply too spooked to go down there myself and investigate. I wasn't sure what I'd find. I didn't think I'd want to see what was down there. Oh, I should also give you a proper layout of the home. This house was very much like a modified ranch-style home. You come in through the front door, and directly in front of you is a forked stairwell. To your right, you can continue down the stairs, which leads to the bathroom directly in front of you. No room to your right, just a wall, and to your left is the basement. No garage. If you were to walk in the front door and continue to ascend up your left, you would go up the stairs to the main living area, the living room, the kitchen, and directly to your right at the top of the stairs is the hallway with a bathroom and one bedroom. Like I said, a very modified, smaller version of a ranch-style home. And I can remember that there were a couple of mornings when I got up and left for work. As I'm going down the stairs, I could hear from behind me somebody almost whispering from the basement, "Come down here," which I immediately recognized as the voice of one of my deceased relatives. It made me stop for a second and look back. Hello? Nothing. Silence. Immediately getting the chills, I just got out of my house and went to work, and tried to ignore it the rest of the day. And that night, I remember I got home, and the second I walk in my house, this thick feeling of just evil is emanating all inside the house. You could feel something is here. The air was thick. The atmosphere, everything had changed. And I feared whatever was down in the basement was now up in the house somewhere. And I'm thinking to myself, all right, you know what? Forget dinner, forget putting anything away, forget TV time, I'm just going to go right to bed. So I walked up the stairs, went to the bathroom, went directly to my room, closed and locked the door, undressed and lay there in bed. And I'll never forget this. I'm laying there in bed, tossing and turning and trying to go to sleep. But I just had this feeling in the pit of my stomach, this premonition. Something was going to happen. I didn't know what, but I was so on edge. That presence was still there. I could feel it lingering. And all of a sudden, out of nowhere, my door handle starts rattling really hard, as if somebody was trying to open my door. I jump up out of bed yelling, "Who's there? Who's there? Who is it?" And the door immediately stops rattling. And you know how you can just sense when someone's directly outside your door? I mean, think of it. Wherever you live, whatever house you live in, if somebody stands right outside your door, it's like your gut just picks up on it. You can just know, you can just sense that somebody's there. That's exactly what this was. And then I heard the breathing, the heavy right outside the door, and I am shaking. I have never shook so hard. I am cowering like a child underneath my sheets, just wanting whatever this thing is to go away. So I just start shouting, "Whatever you are, whoever you are, you're not welcome here. You need to leave now. Go away." And within a couple minutes, the breathing stops, and I noticed the feeling in my gut, the feeling of the presence, kind of just quickly goes at ease. And I sat there on my bed for probably the next 30 to 45 minutes, debating on my course of action. I had it figured out. I quickly got my jeans on, grabbed my jacket, grabbed my keys, and I ran faster than any Olympic runner has ever seen, out the door, down the hall, down the stairs, out the front door, to my car, without caring to even lock up my own house. And I drove to the nearest motel, where I stayed the rest of the night. After this, I would only go back to my house frequently, and periodically to grab things and supplies. I stopped staying there overnight after this, and every time I'd show up, that feeling, that lingering feeling of something wrong, still was there. I knew whatever it was never had gone away. There was something in the basement. In fact, one of my friends was so gracious, he allowed me to stay and crash on his couch for the remainder of my time until I could figure out somebody to buy the house. This went on for a few months afterwards. In fact, I was not able to sell the home till probably about March or April of the following year. So I had that house in my name for only about maybe 4 or 5 months in total. And all the stuff that just happened, that I just explained to you, happened within 30 days' time. Because come December, I was already staying at another friend's house. Definitely not and refusing to stay the night at my own house. I ended up selling the home to an older married couple, which they checked it out themselves, they fell in love with it. And I kind of told them briefly I had been experiencing some very strange things in the house that I did not have an explanation for, and I wasn't really comfortable living in it anymore. They went out to investigate it. They had absolutely no idea why I would feel such things about a house so beautiful, they said. The husband even had a ton of ideas to renovate and turn the basement into his own little shop, which, when they bought, he actually did do that, since he did do a lot of carpentry, and I think even ran his own business, if I remember correctly. So after them giving me a really good offer on it, I sold it to them, and last I heard, they were still loving the house, still live there to this day, and have experienced no strange happenings in that home. They were older, retired, had no children or grandchildren, so this was probably a perfect fit for them. But I always wonder and think back, why they never had any issues, why they never themselves experienced the same haunting I did at that house. What sort of being or entity was trying to get into my room? Why? What would have happened had I did not lock my door that night? Would have came in my room and possessed me? Or worse, was it purposefully trying to scare me out of the house? Or maybe, just maybe, the entity was actually one of the previous owners of the home, and perhaps did not like me and wanted me gone. So many questions and pretty much no answers. But if that's not life, I don't know what is. After selling it to them, I moved out of state, back with some family, and I've not gone back to the house ever since. But the couple and I ended up keeping in contact, only for a few years after. I've lost contact quite a long time ago, but like I said, last I heard, everything was great. So I'm assuming whatever demonic creature, entity, being, poltergeist, ghost, demon, you name it, residing in that home must really like this couple much better than I. Either that, or they're having the worst haunting of their life and being completely quiet about it. I guess I'll never know. My home had been what I thought was entity-free. Boy, was I wrong. I had just finished an intense meditation session, and I laid down to go to sleep, immediately hearing my name being called out. But it sounded like my own voice. There was nobody else in the room besides me. It happened once more, and again, with feeling of something watching me. The feeling stopped, and things seemed to go on as normal. I brushed the experience off as, you know what, maybe I've just been too stressed out lately. Perhaps I should meditate more. Over the coming days, as I'm meditating, this voice would come back. But again, it was my own voice. Not like it was inside my head. This was audibly clear. Something or someone was talking to me, and these feelings accompanying it, like I was being watched. Then, shortly after all of this, everything changed. I woke up one night after having this terrifying dream of an entity standing over the bed staring at me, as if waiting for the right moment to strike down and cut me open. I jumped up out of bed and ran straight into my parents' room, sobbing that there was something in my room. My mother just laughed at me, thinking it was another case of sleep paralysis, until she really saw the state of despair I was in, shaking uncontrollably. She asked what was going on, and I was honest with her. I told her about what I had been experiencing, and from that point on, she would often check in on me at night to make sure I was okay. I don't know why my mother was always like that. She was never a believer in the paranormal, and if you even hinted at the fact that there was something in your room or maybe a shadow moving that shouldn't be, she would be pretty quick to demonize and ridicule you, even if you were her own child. I almost wonder if psychologically it was a safety mechanism or just flat out plain denial, because her herself had grown up around it, and it was all around our house. I learned later on from my aunts or her sisters that their home was filled with all sorts of activity, and they would say that their house was very haunted. Their father or my grandfather was an abusive, severely abusive alcoholic. My aunts claimed he was possessed and would say there were times where he was beating my grandmother, that his eyes would turn solid black, and his voice would change to something that wasn't his. But my grandfather would have no recollection of it at all, and go back to being normal, like everything was fine. Something had control over him. I think things became really real for my mother after she realized that her own 17-year-old daughter was going through very similar things that she did when she was younger. Like, me having these experiences were forcing her to come to terms with reality and know that this was not just a situation of denial and falsehood, but actually something that she had to step up to the plate and check on the well-being of her own daughter. And surprisingly, after all of this, I stopped having dreams about this entity after that. I still did have a few episodes of seeing it standing over me at the edge of my bed, as if wanting me to fall back asleep so it could make its move. This continued on all the way till I moved out of the house on my own. And even sometimes now, to this present day of 2021, I could still sometimes feel its presence watching over me. I no longer practice meditation. I used to do it a lot during high school because I would get these horrible random bouts of anxiety attacks, and I could never understand why. So I felt like meditation was a way to center my mind and to calm my soul and spirit down. Which is another weird thing about all this. I had already been meditating for a good amount of high school, so this whole hearing my voice and seeing this entity in my dreams was so out of left field. Like, I know with ghosts and demons you have to provoke them. Nothing out of the ordinary had happened, and I don't recall doing anything to provoke such actions against me. Surely there's an explanation, but if there is, I don't have one. But I'm curious as to what other people have experienced before. Maybe their answers will help me. One night, when I was just a teenager, we were all huddled around the TV, watching, when something came in the house. We all heard it. We didn't see it. We knew something was there, but we couldn't exactly see what was making the noise. And let me tell you, this thing did not sound friendly. It sounded like something very large, crashing through the walls. And then we all heard it in unison. This low growling, like a dog, but very deep and raspy and guttural. And it was actually moving towards us, towards the family room where we were all at. We were all very freaked out, looking, wondering what the source of this noise was. And we all see these two yellow eyes appear, standing about 7 feet off the ground. Very large eyes. My mom starts screaming, and we could see perfectly this creepy black silhouette thingy. My father, who is a very strong Protestant Christian man, begins calling out for God to protection, and within seconds, it kind of just evaporates into the floor, disappearing out of the house. I'm not sure what this was, but clearly, it had to have been an evil spirit of some kind, or maybe a demon. I don't really know, but I do know whatever it was made itself visible to us for a reason. And none of our family knows how to explain this, other than a demonic entity. Where it came from, I don't know. And why it decided to come after us at that time of day, I don't know either. Strange things are real. I'm not sure what sort of demonic entities are haunting us, but they are very real. I was born in a small town that had been suffering from severe demonic activity since the mid-1800s. When my mother told me this story, she said that even her family believed the house was built on satanic rituals and sacrifices of Native Americans. And the things that went down in that house, in that town, have followed my family and my family's families for generations. That house in particular was built in a time where life in America was a lot more tumultuous. There was a large racial divide, and natives and African Americans were still seen as animals. My personal opinion, and from what I've studied and believe, is that our house, our town, was actually hexed, which would explain the high amounts of demonic activity and poltergeist that we've been seeing. In fact, I even actually remember my grandfather talking about that him and his family talked to an old witch doctor, an old African woman who practiced voodoo, claiming that she sensed a lot of dark energy and negative spirits surrounding his entire family bloodline, that he and his family must have done something heinous. This was my grandfather. This was probably sometime in the 1930s, possibly 40s. So the fact that this lady, whom he never met, had this sort of insight, I think it just goes to tell you something. The house that was built was not a plantation home. It did not host slaves. Nothing nefarious went down in it. It's just the land on it was built, and probably the lives sacrificed in order to build it are what really caused it to have such bad activity and energy. Of course, I'm speculating, and only part of it is actually due from research. My grandfather actually shared a lot of these stories with me, from his grandfather and his great-grandfather, who passed these stories down, who had lived in the home. Now, I think it was in the 1920s. It was definitely before the Great Depression. The house was actually demolished, and I couldn't tell you what happened to that property. I think it got turned into a ranch, if I remember correctly, and is now used as cattle grazing land, or something along those lines. But from what my grandfather had told me from his own stories of his grandfather, they used to have some pretty severe hauntings, and their knowledge of hauntings and entities at the time was much more minimal. Violent entities too. Not the kind that just stand at the edge of your bed and watch you sleep. The kind that break into your house, choke you, kill you, want to attack you, get into your head, cause you nightmares, possess you, cause you to go insane. He had some pretty horrific accounts of things that had happened to his family. A perfect example of this would be my grandfather's grandmother, who was apparently possessed by an entity, nearly killing my grandfather's grandfather with a butcher knife, and had told him that she dreamt of nothing but killing. And her entire personality, her entire being, changed drastically while living in that home. And she said that she was constantly feeling like she was being watched over, and that she felt like a puppeteer being controlled by a puppet master, and having no idea when the puppet master was taking over. One night, my grandfather had told me that his grandfather had told him about large black wolves showing up around the house, trying to break in, claiming that these were actually evil spirits taking the form of animals, telepathically speaking, telling them they wanted to rip out their throats and drink their blood. Like I said, just really horrific stuff, which again supports my theory of them being hexed. Now, of course, my grandfather had his own fair share of things just like this, but not as heinous, or violent, or crazy, but still pretty terrifying and haunting in their own right. And that leads us to present day, with my own family. I'm 38, I have a wife and 3 kids, and I live in a small apartment. I firmly believe that whatever started down my family line has worked its way up generation to generation and is now sitting with me and my other siblings. Because I don't feel right at night. I feel like I too am being watched. and not in a good way. In my house, all the time, I feel unsettled, like something could happen at any moment. Thankfully, my kids, who are 7, 10, and 13, don't notice it, nor do they feel anything out of the ordinary. It's only my wife and I. In fact, just the other night, my wife got up to use the bathroom and screamed and ran back into the room because she saw somebody standing in the bathroom doorway. She said she couldn't see who it was, but that it was just a dark shape standing there. Of course, I got up with my gun, thinking somebody had broken in, but there was nobody there after flicking on all the lights. I checked all the windows and doors. No signs of anybody having broken in. So I don't want to deny that these things aren't here, because they definitely are. Sometimes I'll come home from work and smell this awful smell of rotting meat. Like somebody has bought a pound of ground beef, tore it open, and has just let it sit out there in the sun for 4 or 5 days, and it reeks. Except the smell is all over the house, and I can't get rid of it. Again, my kids don't smell it. My wife doesn't really smell it. It's just me, so I just try and ignore the scent as best I can. In the past 10 years alone, we have moved twice, and we have still dealt with the same situation. Haunted houses, demons, family possessions, etc. This has been going on for years now, and I feel like the only real thing that's changed is when my father passed away back in 2015, which I can remember him acting really crazy towards the end of his life, shouting, acting bizarre and paranoid and frightened, claiming they were always surrounding him and they were coming to get him. Just these random bouts of fright that none of us could really understand. He claimed he would see shadow people coming to take his body from him. One thing I can tell you, though, is the nightmares don't stop, and I don't think they ever will. My story starts in a small town in Poland. Growing up, I lived on my grandfather's farm with him and my own parents. Life was simple back then. We would wake up at dawn, do our morning chores before heading into the fields to tend the horses and plow any fertile lands that were left unattended. I would usually take off after lunch, exploring the surrounding woods for hours on end until it got dark, or one of us accidentally caught pneumonia from being out in the cold too long. My favorite spot, though, was a large clearing not too far from where we lived, surrounded by tall trees and bracken ferns that seemed untouched by human hands. The grass was overgrown and unkempt, and although it wasn't the most inviting places to be at night, especially for a young girl like myself back then, I was never afraid of anything out there. I always knew it was getting close to dusk. That's when my favorite animals would emerge from their hidden dens and take over the clearing. We had badgers, white-tailed deers, owls with tufts as black as coal on their heads that seemed to almost glisten and glow in the moonlight. Even now, as I retell this story, I can see everything so clearly. Every blade of grass, every little detail on each animal's fur. Even smell the musky scent of earth and trees all around. It brings up memories of simpler times. My grandfather's large, rough hands ruffling my hair, and the warm embrace of my parents when I returned to our little farmhouse at dusk for dinner time. You might be wondering why I'm telling you all of this. The reason is, these thoughts are what keep me sane. To give you an understanding of what it's like for me now, I need to tell you about the night everything changed. It was a quiet day on the farm. My father had taken off that morning around dawn, leaving just my grandfather and I behind in the house. My mother, unfortunately, passed away many years before. As per usual, I went out after lunch and spent hours in the clearing until darkness was creeping up very quickly, signaling that it was time to head home. It was around this time I noticed the animals acting strange. Every noise startled them, and they huddled close to each other, watching me out of the corner of their eyes like some kind of unknown predator, wondering what I was going to do next. Even the owls above had vacated their tree branches for safer perches in the trees far above my head. Although it was unnerving at first, I shrugged it off as normal animal behavior and continued walking through the clearing towards my favorite log, near where the streams had begun its descent down into a nearby valley. I can remember how beautiful it all looked at night, with only the moonlight illuminating everything in sight, especially on nights like this, when it was clearly a full moon. The way the shadows danced on every little bump and hillock, brought up by images of goblins or elves lurking just beyond my sight. I remember even giggling to myself at the thought of a fairy living in each tree or bush. That's when I witnessed something that will stay with me for the rest of my life. It was just above my head. This ominous shadow blocking out the moonlight on top of what looked like a large boulder, right next to where I was walking. It wasn't there before. My immediate reaction was fear. Sharp, cold prickles traveling up and down my spine until they reached my head, numbing it completely. The giggle that I had died in my throat, and I began moving away from the shadow as quickly as I could, without making any sudden movements or attracting its attention. Whatever it was. It wasn't the only thing that had now drawn my attention, though. Amongst all the activity and strange behavior that I just experienced, this was something else. A strong sense of dread and malice were now seeping through every pore in my skin like poison. My legs felt heavy and weak at the same time. I couldn't move them, even if it meant life or death. Even now, as I think back writing all this down, all these years later, my anxiety begins creeping up on me. For many nights after seeing whatever it was that night, I would wake up screaming for no reason, other than there were dark apparitions floating around outside my house while I slept. Some of them I could see were human, but with their features and shapes distorted and malformed, as if they had been melted by a candle wax. That's the only way I can describe it. As if there was a wax sculpture of a face, and somebody poured a flame on it to deform it. The trees surrounding me silenced immediately in my outburst, and for several seconds, there was no sound other than my own breathing, ragged and desperate, like that of a dying man under his deathbed sheets. It wasn't until I heard the first snap of a twig somewhere off behind me that my senses returned to normal. Something big had moved in those woods, and whatever it was now making its way towards me. My muscles sprang back to life, but I still did nothing other than stand up and grab a large stick on the ground that was next to me. I held it in front of me like a club, ready, while I slowly backed away from where the sound had come from. It was when the howls had begun that my fear became complete, utter panic. There were screams unlike anything human or animal should be able to make. And yet, there was something else in those sounds. Words, screaming obscenities at me in some language I could not understand, but still understood perfectly what they meant. They were vile things, promising suffering through eternity, just looking at them twice. My only chance of staying alive and protecting my family, if they weren't already dead, was to get back home as quickly as possible and lock the doors. I broke into a run as soon as my legs were ready to move again. Not looking back, I already knew whatever was out there wasn't human, and that it could possibly catch me much easier than I could ever hope to escape. My grandmother had warned me about the dangers of staying up too late and going into those woods, even before she had passed away. But at 11 years old, I didn't listen. Nothing bad happened, at least until now. To think, it's been almost 30 years since then. But sometimes at night, when everything is quiet and dark around me, like it was that night, they say your life flashes before your eyes right before you die. I wonder if what chased me through the woods and what killed my family was the same thing. I don't think it matters anymore. If not then, something else is out there now, still looking for me. Some evil spirit controlling a physical, manifested body. I'm shaking just thinking about that night all these years ago. There's no doubt in my mind that it was some kind of demon or evil spirit that possessed that body. But I never planned to go back and look at it again. nor do I ever. And ever since then, shadows have had a whole new meaning to me. They're not just patches of nothingness cast by light on the ground. They are malevolent beings, silently watching our every move from behind their masks, waiting for an opportunity to strike. Back in the 1940s, my grandfather became possessed by coming into contact with an occult book, from what I've been told. I'm here to tell his story. My grandfather, Joseph Doherty, was an Irish Catholic raised in the slums of New York City. He lived a hard life until he met my grandmother during her time as a nurse. The two fell deeply in love and had 3 children together. He worked hard on the docks of New York to provide for his family. His life was somewhat happy until he somehow came in contact with an old occult book in the cellar of his grandmother's home. The book had apparently been there for some time due to its malnourished-looking pages and tattered cover. When my grandfather came into contact with it, it had a change on him, like the energy went into him. He had went on a rampage, I had heard, throughout the house, ripping up every painting and picture that depicted any figure remotely resembling Christ or God, gathering up all the crucifixes and rosaries, burning them outside before storming back in the house, locking himself up in the room, getting naked, defecating, and vomiting blood. He began to howl at the moon and act like an animal, completely crazy. My grandmother, completely traumatized by all of this, went to get him exorcised, but he had kept himself locked away, reading this book continuously, and he did not eat or sleep for 7 days and 7 nights, before finally breaking out of the window, butt naked, and drowning himself in the ocean. I know that's a very short version, but from the story passed down from my family, whatever information was in that book drove him mad, and he was a pretty normal guy before this. The book in which he read from was cursed, and with good reason. Some of my family have worked together to try and destroy it, burning it after his death, but they ended up dying in a house fire during the attempt. My grandmother died shortly after, when I was very young, so the story has been passed down from family. As far as the whereabouts of the book, nobody knows what happened to it. I just hope it's still not in our family's possession, and when dark energies surround it. I was driving home one night. It was wet, rainy, and visibility was very poor due to the weather. As I'm driving down the road, I see this man off on the side of the road come sprinting out towards the center. He's in a full-on suit, completely out of style, and wondering why he does not have a coat on. But he runs out so quickly that I fail to slam on my brakes in time. But here's the strange thing. As my car goes, it goes right through him. I clearly hit him with my vehicle, but nothing happened. He just vanished. Did I just run into a ghost? Well, the next day that I ended up driving this road, sure enough, that exact same spot that he or the person ran out in front of my car. There was a cross there that I did not see before. Somebody had died from a car accident back in 2002. It looked to be a man in his later 40s. I think hit and killed by a drunk driver. It makes me wonder if this night I had seen his spirit running across the road as he fled for his life while trying not to get hit by the same driver. These things makes you wonder. I have 3 sisters, which I'm lucky enough to still have alive. Growing up, we were always very close, and none of us could wait for the day that one of us had children, so that our children would grow up together. My mother was a single parent since my father left when I was very young. He never reappeared in any significant way, so she focused all her attention on being the best mom she could possibly be, to me and my 3 sisters. By doing this, it took away from herself as much as possible, leaving her with little energy at times to even take care of herself. Nevertheless, she did her best, not only taking care of myself and my sisters, but also Our home, which consisted of 2 stores along with an apartment below us that we rented out. My sisters and I ran in age from 18 to 8 years old, which meant that at any given time, there were always kids running around outside of the house, screaming and making as much noise as possible. It was a great neighborhood, lots of place to grow up in, with other children to play with. Everybody knew everybody that lived on our street. It wasn't very big. It seemed like it would have been an easy pick for anybody wanting to snatch a child without being noticed. Nothing bad ever happened though, and we were never really supervised when we went to play outside. None of us ever gave it a thought really. We all trusted each other completely. The 3 older ones of us would all play together, while the youngest played with herself, or joined in on one of her games if she was in the mood to do so. Sometimes, she would just want to be dropped off at the neighbor's house to play with her children, which my mother allowed since they were about the same age anyway. One day, when I came home from school, something had changed. Our neighbor, Mrs. Walters, who everybody knows her as Miss W, asked me if my sister Sarah was here, because apparently she had gone out with my mom grocery shopping, and never made it back home. Mrs. W wanted to know if she had been dropped off at the supermarket at about 4:30 Pacific Standard Time. This is when my sister had not returned. Miss W got worried and went to have a look for her. My sister was nowhere in sight, so Mrs. W went inside the store, where they told her that Sarah left over 45 minutes ago to come back again, since she had forgotten all her money with the revenue from selling their produce today at the market. Which is very unlike Sarah. She's extremely responsible and never forgets anything. Even more so helpful when it came to our neighbors and important people in our lives. I thanked Mrs. W for letting me know what happened, running home as fast as I could when I noticed that nobody was there but our dog Patches, in case they came back early from their errands or whatever they wanted. I ran in, called for my mother, my older sister, and Sarah, only getting silence in return. So, I decided to go upstairs and see where they were, which I noticed that Sarah's bedroom door was wide open, which never happened. We're all pretty neat people, like things put away in their proper place. Sarah's room was empty and oddly clean. After searching for my mother in every single room, in the house, including the basement, I decided that I would go look for somewhere else because nobody was here, which when I first started to panic and run outside, not knowing what to do or where I should go first. I didn't know if my sister was in danger and needed me to save her because she always looked out for me. Anybody else did, even though we were still just kids ourselves. I didn't know if my sister was in danger and needed me to save her. The thought that something had really hurt her crossed my mind. That maybe she was in trouble and needed rescued. I don't know. I had asked Mrs. W if she could please call the police, and I told her where Sarah might have gone to. The police were called, and when they came over and took me into another room and asked me questions, I told them everything that had happened, along with giving them everything I knew about Sarah's last whereabouts. It was agonizing hours until my mother was found. She had been found unconscious in her car, and Sarah had been still missing. Police continued their search for Sarah, and this went on for days and days at a time, until about a week later, Sarah mysteriously appeared on our front door. We were all overjoyed to see her, but she appeared different. There was something different about her. She wasn't the same. The strange thing is that she seemed completely clean. She was still in the exact same outfit she was on the day she disappeared. She wouldn't talk. She would hardly even acknowledge us. She just seemed like something was different. And there were points where we noticed that her personality had drastically changed, from going from upbeat and outbeat to very reserved, saying strange things, acting weird, anger outbursts, a complete 180 in personality. We noticed other things too. Sometimes she would walk around the house, speaking quietly under her breath in a language we didn't quite understand. It sounded like muttering or something. And she would spend hours sitting at the living room table, drawing in a binder notebook, drawing all these crazy, strange symbols that nobody had ever seen before. muttering to herself maniacally, like some sort of madwoman. And probably, easily the most terrifying of all, is when sometimes we would look at her in the eyes, and her eyes would go solid black, and she would just look back at you and grin, like she knew that you knew something was very different about her. Something had overtaken her. Something evil